And you said like I remember you saying if we get lost a little bit to follow the seam where they go, kind of.
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, we can zip on back to that. That's excellent. Okay. Wait, where'd I go? Well, where did I put it? Now I can't remember which slide it was. Let's go backwards. Okay, so this slide will work. So actually, let's use this one. So let's pretend you were sewing along and you had started with your center, which is A in this block, and then you sewed on your strip, which is B. My computer is behind me, that's why I keep looking away. You sewed on B and C and D and E. And if you just had that center and you were trying to figure out which way you were going, if you look on either side of B, there's a seam that's pointing to the right in that graphic.
Okay.
And if you look around the other edges, there's only one seam pointing out. So if pretending I only have the ones that have letters on them sewn on, the rest of them aren't there yet. So if I was looking at C, there's that seam between D and C pointing up, but there's just one.
Okay.
And if I was looking at the D side, there's that seam between D and E pointing to the left, I guess it is, but there's just one.
Okay.
And I just sewed on E, so that was the last piece I sewed on. There's no seams down there. And then I come around to that B side, and there's two seams. There's the seam between B and C, and there's the seam between B and E, and they're pointing over there to the right, so you know that right side is where your next block goes.
Okay.
And then you can also count your laps. That's the next slide.
Gotcha.
So you know you're done for this pattern when you've got your center plus 3 more laps. And if you count to the right and up and to the left and down, there should be 3 strips going around all the way around.
Okay.
And when you get going, you're sort of spiraling out. It's easy to kind of lose track. So if you can just count from that center how many laps you have, it'll help you keep straight where you are in the process. So Marquita got her sewing machine in the mail like the day we started class, I think. So she has been figuring this out on her own. She's doing a great job learning to just stitch from taking it out of the box for the very first time. So I'm very impressed with her.
Well, that's good. Yes, if you have anything stitched together, you've done good. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
She's
good.
really doing great.
Thank you.
Okay, let's jump ahead. Last week we left off here. So everybody's sewing at their own pace, but as far as where we are in the class, this was where we left off. So you were going to do 12 of the blocks that are half and half with the strong diagonal, and then 4 that are all your background color. And those go into the corners. Let's see if I can jump all the way back to our layout. So if you look at the corner blocks, it's all the same color group all the way around. Of course, this graphic makes it look like it's all one color, but you could be mixing up your prints and fabrics within your color groups. And whatever you decided was your rule to give you that strong contrast between groups. It doesn't really matter what your rule is, whatever makes you happy, as long as your eyeball knows right away what the groups are. So it could be warm and cool, dark and light, whatever you come up with that works for you. And your little accent color in the middle to pop. We're jumping ahead. So that brings us up to top assembly. If you have all your squares made and you've trimmed your edges, so whether you were using a square acrylic template like this to trim around the sides and make sure they're neat and tidy, a nice straight line on the edge, a nice 90-degree in each corner. So you don't want it to be like a diamond. You want it a square, and you want them all the same size because no one is perfect. If you have one outlier that's a little bit puny, it's always okay to just add one more strip or two more strips and beef him up and get him up to size. And if your seam allowance was a little crooked, you have to do a little squaring. If your seam allowance was a little thick and you lost a little bit of material in your seams, your blocks might not square to the, if you were a perfect robot, your blocks would square exactly to 14 inches. But as long as you pick a size that is consistent, that works for your blocks. So you'll take a look at your blocks. If you're happy with how big they are and you want to trim them down, you know, ideally you don't want to waste fabric because it's not free, but it's also just fabric. So if you lose a little fabric, it's just fabric. So you can trim them down to a consistent size of squares, whatever your size is. If you're a perfect robot, it's 14. If it's any other size, it'll work as long as they're the same. Okay. Our quote that we like to look at, finished is better than perfect. Our goal for this class is to make it through and have a beautiful heirloom that we love. It doesn't have to be perfect. First topic, check twice, sew once. So in these slides, I call it dark light, but whatever is your star color group and whatever is your background color group, you should have 12 of those that are half and half with that strong diagonal. So all of one group is around one corner and all of the other group is around the other corner. And then you should have 4 that are your background color group, whatever that is, all the way around. And that's when you know you're done sewing blocks and you're ready to start assembling the top. I think Christine is trying to get in. Ah, she is. Ta-da! Sorry about that, Christine. I was sharing my screen and I didn't see you. Did I get you, Miss Christine? This thing asks me if people want to join. I feel like that's a setting that I should have set to something different, and then I'm not always looking at it. All right, so the next thing we're going to check for is, have they been squared to match, which we talked about. If you don't have a square template and you just have a straight edge, you can also square with that. So you'll make one side straight, and then you'll line up that side that you just made straight with a line, one of the markings on your ruler, and that's what gives you that 90 degree, because these markings are at a nice right angle to this edge, and you'll cut along, and you'll just make your way around your block, making 4 cuts. And this is an acrylic cutting ruler that goes with a rotary cutter, but you can also do that with any old regular straight edge that you already have, and you can mark it out and cut it with a good sharp pair of scissors. So there's ways to do it, whatever equipment you have at hand. It's not that you can't do it. That's what I use, so that's what I hold up in my demo. Okay, the next thing, check twice, sew once, is to look at your layout diagram. 12 of your blocks are exactly the same, and the only thing that's different about them to make that star is the way that they're turned, and it's easy to get mixed up. So you'll lay out your blocks in the layout using the diagram really carefully and kind of check twice. I will say, in the blue and yellow diagrams, it's right. There's one image out there in the black and white that I misturned one of the triangles. So all of your star legs pointing all the directions, there's 2 up, 2 to the side, 2 down, and 2 to the other side. They're all symmetrical. If one of your sides is a little bit different, that means you're following my diagram that I had a boo-boo in. So the ones in the slides are correct. And then you'll be ready to sew. So this is the correct diagram. Just seeing here. One of those where I did the mock-up of the kit, I had this little square here rotated the wrong direction, so it's easy to do. So you'll lay all your squares out and make sure that you can make the star, your Missouri star, out of your log cabins like that. And then you'll be ready to sew. And all you're doing, all of these half and half blocks are exactly the same. And you're just turning them to get the desired look. Does anybody have all 16 blocks already made? Ooh, 2. Very good. It looks like Will, who I don't think is on the call, but he did talk to me today. He's making a mini quilt. So he's going to do a 1 block wonder, which is a good way to dip a toe in. Go ahead.
Yeah, Christine says that she doesn't have any audio. She says she thinks that her laptop is finally dying.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's going to a Bluetooth device.
I
So
don't
I
know.
have my little headset, and if I don't have it on, my audio still tries to go to it. And it's playing. It's just playing across the room in my headset.
Yeah.
I don't know. She said no Bluetooth. How did she hear that? Check the volume on your computer too. Maybe it just got turned down. Okay, so next slide. I'm going to go ahead and, oh, there's captions? I didn't know that. Awesome. The things I didn't even know. Okay, I'm going to try to push this back and see if we can get a good angle. So I have a little sample here, and it's not the same as the quilt we're making for this class, and that's not to confuse people, but it does go to say, whoops, gotta get rid of that cord. These techniques work whatever quilt you're making. So if it is this quilt that we're making today or some quilt that you're making in the future, the same basic rules apply. So first you're gonna lay out your layout like you think you want it. And I know that seems excessive, like it's a bigger quilt, you're gonna need like a whole dining room table or maybe your floor to really lay it out, but it does help keep you straight. And it's a lot easier to check twice than to seam rip and sew twice. So take your time with the layout. And some quilts have secondary patterns that appear, and it's hard to tell block to block where you're at. So you kind of want to step back and get the overview and make sure it looks like you want it to look. So you'll take, I'm going to swap these for a sec. That's the next one. So you have your layout the way you want it, and pretend these are my log cabin blocks. This is just simple squares just for demonstration purposes. You're going to take the second one, close it over the first one like a book, and then you'll be sewing along here. Because when you go to your machine, your needle is on the right side. So you'll close it like a book, line it up really carefully. So what I'm going to do is line this top corner, and my row is going this way. So I'm not concerned as much as you would think about lining up these two edges that I'm going to sew together. If you're a perfect robot, so these are squares that I just cut out perfectly square. So they'll line up to the top and they'll line up to the side. There's no seams going on in here. There's nothing going on inside my block to keep them from being perfect. So I can perfectly line up this top edge, this bottom edge, or this side all the way around. If I had sewn these blocks out of little bitty pieces of fabric, there's a lot of opportunities for it to get just a little bit off, whether that's my seam allowance, whether that's being a little crooked, whether it was my cutting, all those steps that I did to get to a block, there's room for a little bit of being off in all of those, which can result in your square not being 100% square. You're going to take care of a lot of that when you do your squaring. You can trim off a lot of messiness and trim off a lot of mistakes and make it pretty perfect. But you still might have a little wonkiness. So if you have to choose, if you cannot perfectly align these two sides that you're going to sew and these two sides at the top, you're going to prefer to align these two ones at the top, because when I open this up, I want it to be a long straight row. So what's going to matter is that these edges line up and make a nice straight row. This little flap here that I'm sewing together, you would think, oh, I want to line that up so I can sew along there. But if you have to pick, if you can't get them both to line up perfectly, this is going to be hidden in the back of your quilt. And no one's really going to see it. If someone opens up your quilt and nitpicks that little flap in there, that person is not your friend. You take your quilt back and give it to someone who appreciates you. So if you have to choose, you're going to align this top side. So let's use these pins as my pretend. And I'm going to pin right where I would stitch. And I'm going to make sure these are lined up. And this is just pretend stitching for now. I'm going to try to pin straight-ish right at my seam allowance. So when I open up, and I have this straight line on my mat here, hopefully you can see that, and I line up, that top edge will line up nice and straight along a straight line. Whether you're using a mat to compare that or a ruler, whatever you're using to see what your straight line is, it'll make it real obvious if you're nice and straight. So that as you piece your row together, you're making one long straight line. So let's put that one aside. This block, let's lay these on top of each other. So what I did is I took a perfectly square block and I just cut a little wonky sliver off. So now, I don't know if you can see, I've got this little like wedge that's missing. So what if I was trying to sew these? And this is exaggerated. That's a pretty big wedge. Let me get my target box out of here. Maybe we can get a little closer and get a better view. So what if I'm trying to line up these two blocks? And this edge that I'm sewing to is a little bit weird. So you can still fold it over like a book. And I'm going to make sure this line lines up. And you can see I've got a little bit of wedge here showing of my monkey fabric. And I've got a little bit of wedge here showing of my paw fabric. You do need to make sure you've got enough overlap that you can catch both fabrics securely in your seam allowance. So in this case, my monkey fabric is straight. So I'm going to do my pinning, my seam allowance from my monkey fabric. Laying flat there. In real life, this would be you sewing, but it's just easier for demonstration for me to throw some pins in there and show what that would look like. So I'm stitching along, doot, doot, doot. And my seam allowance is 3/8, so I'm going to pin these at 3/8. And then I know what my seam allowance is because I measured from my needle to the side of my foot. And then when I open this up, my line across the top here, maybe that's easier to see, is nice and straight. Even though when I flip this over, my seam allowance is a little bit crookedy, but that's getting hidden in the seam allowance. So I care a little bit less about this. In an ideal world, these would match perfectly, that would match perfectly, everything's perfectly square. In real life, things get a little wonky. So if you have to pick, align this top edge. If you align these edges straight together here, when you fold open, you'll have a nice straight line and your row will continue across straight. Otherwise, you'll end up with like this chevron shape that either goes up, 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 or goes up, down, up, down, up, down. And then when you go to sew to that, where are you sewing? You don't have a nice straight line to sew to. So you'll either have to trim, which is going to cost you some box size and cost you some fabric, or you're like, what am I sewing to? Where's straight? So you have to make yourself a nice straight line. So this is my little sample of what to do if you had a crookedy block. Okay. Did that lose anybody? Are we like good to go with that, or is that more confusing than it was worth? Okie doke. So let's take a look at what that looks like at the machine. And I'm going to pretend this is straight. So I'm going to do him this way just to take that out of there. Okay, so let's come on over to the machine. Can you see? I think you can. I'm going to turn on a little bit of light here because I think it will help you a little bit to see a little bit. Hopefully there's not too much glare there. So here's my layout. You're going to be following your diagram. This is just some little sample blocks. Actually, let me put these guys up. So this is a little pretend quilt. This is a little 2x4 simple block pretend quilt. And I'm going to make this bigger so I can see it. Well, heck, where am I? I can't see myself. All right. So my layout is all laid out. Yours is probably going to be on a table next to you. You take your second block, fold it like a book over your first block. If I can't make both sides line up where I'm sewing and my top edge, then I'm going to prefer to line up my top edge and be really fussy to get it just aligned. So these corners are matching and I have it nice and straight. So I have a little bit of fabric poking out. I'm just going to brush with my fingernail and bring the monkey fabric up and align perfectly with my other one. The other thing that I'm checking for is that this fabric is directional. See, these paws all go the same direction. So before I sew, when I'm open, I want to make sure that this goes whatever direction I want it to. So what you'll be looking for is what way is that triangle supposed to be spun? All right, so we're nice and aligned. We'll bring it to the machine and use the same seam allowance that you used before. So I'm using the edge of my presser foot as a guide. You might be using a 1/4 inch guide foot. Whatever you did before, you can do again. So I lower my needle into there, and I'm going to sew nice and neat along here. You'll notice I didn't backstitch at the beginning and the end because I'm going to cross over that seam with another seam, so I don't have to worry about that. So when I open up, I should have a nice straight line that goes all the way across the 2 blocks. Then I'm going to do it again. So I've got my other 2. So just like your quilt, there's 4 blocks in my little pretend quilt. So I'm going to do the same thing, fold it over, match my corner up perfectly, just so. If I can't match where I'm about to sew and my top edge both, I'm going to prefer this top edge, because what I really want is when these blocks fold out, them to be in a nice straight line. And I'm going to do the same seam. If you're new to stitching, I'm using all of my fingers of both hands to guide this. You don't have to push and pull the fabric because you've got feed dogs to do that, but I'm steering it, and I don't just like let go and like, hope that it goes under, because this is going to do whatever. I also don't close my eyes and take my hands off the wheel when I'm driving down the freeway. So the car is going forward because I have my foot on the gas pedal, same as the sewing machine, but I'm steering. I'm watching where I'm going. I'm seeing how close I am to the yellow line. I'm looking at what's going on around me. And it's no different. So 2 hands on the wheel, 2 hands on the fabric. And you hit your gas and you make your adjustments and slow down as often as you need to be nice and tidy, just like in your car. It's a lot like driving a car. So At this point, I can't hold the fabric with this hand, so I'm going to use my left hand and guide it the rest of the way. So don't just turn it loose, because you will get this little piece will either go out or in, and you'll either kind of round off your corner or you'll have like this extra beak. Okay, so I have these two. I'm going to check my layout again, make sure it's how I want it. And then I'm going to take the two of them together. This would be a good time to press. If I were not tied to a video machine, I would press at my real sewing machine iron. And I'm going to do the same thing. So now these two units together are like a block. And I'm going to close them like a book. I'm going to line up my corner super fussy. Now I have a nice long run of fabric, and I can make sure my line, the longer piece of fabric that you can align, the more straight it'll line up. So if you're trying to align something to a little 1-inch piece, it's really hard to tell how accurate you are. But now I have a pretty good run. So I can align this fabric all the way back to here. And if it lines up all the way out here, that's a pretty straight line. I'm going to lay it nice and flat. This would be a little bit nicer if I had pressed it. But you don't want to see me get up and untangle from all these cords and walk over there. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So that same seam allowance. And do whatever you did before. I happen to be using the edge of my presser foot. And if I were to measure that, it is 3/8 of an inch. Traditional standard for quilting is 1/4 of an inch, and they do make a foot with a little guide that you put your fabric up against, and it's exactly at 1/4 inch, and it helps you hold a nice, straight, consistent 1/4 inch. You may or may not have one of those. You can get by without it if you don't have it. So now I've got my blocks, and I have made a nice long row. And if I did a nice job of aligning this top edge, all the way from way over here to way over here should be a nice straight line. And ideally, I would have a nice straight line at the bottom. Mine is not, and I will tell you that has to do with I didn't press between blocks. So ideally, you've got all these seams are nice and parallel. If you have to come back and shave off a little fabric to make it perfectly straight, it happens. People do it all the time. Alrighty. So, oh, it looks like Will did join. Yay! All right, so then this is going to be your little pro tip. Let me share my presentation again. This guy. So seam allowance. That's these little flaps in the back. So for your first row that I am calling A in the picture, you could call it George if you wanted, you're going to take your seam allowances and you're going to press them all from left to right so that the flap goes to the right on all of these. All right, and there's your first row. The next thing you're going to do is, so your next row. So in my pretend quilt, this would be my next row. And when I flip this guy over, I'm going to sew all, press all of these seam allowances from right to left, so that all my little flappies back here aim to the left. And the reason that I'm doing that, so if this seam allowance goes this way and that seam allowance goes the other way, when I go to sew these, so it's always pretty side together. And let's say I have this seam allowance pressing this way and this seam allowance pressing that way. When I go to join these major seams where the blocks join, they will do what is called locking or nesting. So I'm not sure if that's even visible. My little flap is going over here, and this little flap is going over here. So basically that makes like a little bump when the seam allowance is under the fabric, it's kind of bumped up, and those two bumps press against each other. And I can feel with my fingers, if those were misaligned, I would feel a gap. And if those were crossed over, I would feel like a hump. So I want those two seam allowances right exactly on each other. And I can feel them locked together. I can like slide my fingers and press those two seam allowances together and feel that they lock or nest, you'll sometimes hear, and butt them up against each other really nicely. So this is after you've done all your rows and you're starting to join your rows together into a whole sheet. So the top sheet of your quilt is called the top quilt, or sometimes called the flimsy. And I like, ideally, my seam allowances on the bottom to face toward me because I can't see them, and I don't want to worry about what they're doing under the needle. If you have your choice, it's nice if the seam allowances, these are going to face up. So this is my example of my messy one. I'm a human being and I'm not perfect. So you can see that this edge, and I exaggerated, I put a big wedge so you could see it on the camera. But in real life, this would be less than about 1/4 of an inch if you are off, and it's going to hide in your seam allowance. But what I care about is that this side is nicely joined. I'm going to put my needle in, and let's take a couple of anchoring stitches. Just a few. I'm going to double check that my seams are nice and locked. I'm going to double check that the first couple of inches are nicely aligned here along my little straight edge that I made when I sewed my row. And this is more a line, pinch, and sew. So what's under the needle, that's already water under the bridge. You can't really focus on what's back here because you've already sewn that. That's gone. You can't really focus. You're going to start to have a pretty big piece of fabric here, and I can't really worry about what's going on all the way down on this end. I can't hold that much fabric at a time. I can't pay attention to that much fabric at a time. That's like worrying about when you're going to make that left turn in Houston. We're not there yet. So I really want to make sure these couple of inches right in front of me are nicely aligned, and I can feel this is locked, and I'm using both hands to keep the fabric aligned and keep it lined up with the edge of my presser foot. And I'm going to sew a short distance. And then I'm going to do it again. I'm going to align, I'm going to pinch, and I'm going to sew. And your distance that you can pay attention to might be 1.5 inches. And you might pause every 1.5 inches and get your breath and collect yourself together and move forward. It might be 5 inches. It might be 6 inches. Those are all kind of reasonable places to stop. And I'm going to keep sewing until my needle crosses that piece of thread where I was holding those seams locked, which means when I open this up, my little corner there is going to be nice and sharp. They're not going to be askewed. They're going to be lined up. So now that the needle is holding this one, I'm going to move on to the next one. So in real life, I would have pressed, and these would all be going up on this bottom one and down on this top one. These might not be exact, but you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to line them up so they lock. I'm going to pinch them together, and I'm going to ease in any gap. So this might be off 1/16 of an inch or so. I'm going to hold them so they're perfect, and I'm going to let the sewing machine kind of slurp up any extra fabric. And hopefully they're not too bad off where I get a little pleat. And I might even take my fingernails, so my top is a little bit baggy here. I might take my fingernails and ease that in. I'm encouraging the top fabric to go a little bit faster and kind of spaghetti slurp up just a little bit of fabric so I come out perfect. And I'm going to pause when I need to pause. When I get to where I was holding it, I'm going to stop. And you'll find, so I didn't sew this last piece on, so I have to pretend to lock seams here. I'm going to align to my next stopping point. So in different quilt patterns, you have different areas that really need to line up for the quilt to look right. In our quilt, it's really just the corners between your blocks. Inside the blocks, there's no, they call it matching of seams. So this is really the only place that we care about our seams lining up nicely. And I did that on purpose so that we can kind of get the basics of stitching down before we move on to more advanced things like getting your stitching to line up nice and neat. So in real life, you'll continue on. I just didn't sew the last square on here for my little demonstration piece, so I'm ending early. And then when you open this up, these corners should be nicely matched. There's a good example here. So all my little corners come to a point right in the same spot, nice and tidy. And that's what you're going for. It's something to work toward. If you're off by a little bit, is it the end of the world? No. But that's kind of the goal. And that's a nice skill to learn, because later on, when you're making quilts that might have arrows that point toward each other or some kind of shape where it matters, that locking of the seams helps your little points come out nice and accurate. The other thing it does is it keeps so much fabric from sort of bunching up in the same spot on the back, which later on can be hard to sew over if you have too much going on fabric-wise. And then once you sew your strips together into sheets, we're not really doing a whole lot of sewing after that, so you can take these long seams and just press them to one side or the other. There are lots of ways to do all the skills that we're talking about today. Some people press their seams open. The benefit of this method, it takes a little bit longer. You have to come with your nail first and kind of scrape, and then come with your iron afterwards. So you do like a finger press, and then you'll press with your iron. The benefit to this is that I have only 2 layers of fabric here and 2 layers of fabric here, so it makes a much flatter seam. And some people really like to have a nice flat seam. The cons to this method is it takes a little bit longer to go in there and get these apart and get your iron in there. And it's not quite as strong, because right at this point, I've got 2 folds of fabric just kissing, and the only thing holding them together is that little bit of thread. If I have them pressed to one side, yeah, I've got 4 layers of fabric here. I've got my 2 flaps of seam allowance. I'm sorry, 3. I've got my 2 flaps of seam allowance and my fabric. So it's a little bit bulkier, but it's stronger, because at no point do I have 2 folds kissing with no fabric behind it. So I've got fabric behind my seam at this point. So it's a little bit faster, it's a little bit stronger. I don't find pressing my seam allowance to the side to be a problem. And then it allows you to have that little bump. So if I want to sew something adjoining this that meets up, I can sew that, I can press that seam allowance the other way, and I can lock those seams together, and it's going to give me really precise corners. And that's a good technique to learn. This quilt is not as sensitive to precise little points. It's not as fiddly as some other quilt patterns, but if you do this a lot, you'll run into patterns that are going to want to have nice points that line up, and that's how people do that. So you're going to sew your blocks according to your layout into rows, and then you fold your rows right sides together, and you sew your rows together, and you'll keep adding them on until you have your whole top done, and you'll be pressing. Ideally, you will press with your iron every time you sew, and just make that a habit. It is faster not to press, but you'll have wonkier results. And you can see in my demo, I cheated because I didn't want to get up on the video and trip over cords and go to my iron. But my stuff is a little wonkier because I did not take my time and press. If you're going to go through all the effort to do this, why not take your time and make your job easy with a nice, happy press in between seams? Okie doke. And I am ahead of myself on slides. So we stitched the rows into strips on this slide. You had your individual blocks. You made long strips out of them. And then here we're taking those strips and sewing our rows together. And when you are done, you will have made your first top quilt. And you'll hear on like the blogs and stuff, they call it a flimsy because it's really just like one layer of fabric and it's very flimsy. When you give it the batting and the backing and do all the quilting, it gives the quilt a lot more body. And that's why they don't call that, that's why it's called the flimsy. It's the flimsy one. Okie doke. Ah, I'm crooked. Yeah. Slightly better. Slightly less crooked. All right. And that really is it. If you are traveling around with your quilt or you're storing it, you're taking it in and out of a drawer, in and out of a project bag or whatever you have, these raw edges, if I am like hard on this and pulling on it, I can warp this fabric. Like you can see how that looks like bacon? This fabric that I didn't do that to is like nice and straight. And then like I did this and you can see it's like warfully like bacon. So just that much handling. See how it kind of flares out? Just that much handling has warped this fabric a little bit. And if you ever have a quilt pattern where you have to cut diagonally on the fabric across the threads, that it warps even easier. So there's a couple of techniques you can do while you're sort of handling this when you take it out for a little sewing session and put it back away. So you'll want to fold it with your raw edges to the inside. And that, now if I have friction from putting this in and out of a drawer, it's on an edge that's folded and sewn, and it's a little more stable in the middle of the quilt. And I try to take my kind of messy raw edges and hide those so they don't rub against other stuff. The other thing that you can do is called stay stitching. And if you're going to store a quilt top for a long time before you finish it, or individual blocks that you worked on, all you do is put the block under your presser foot, lower your presser foot, and sew a little 1/4 inch seam all the way around. And basically you're sealing off those raw edges and stabilizing it with just a line of stitching all the way around the outside. So anytime you're going to be handling fabric a lot, anytime you're concerned about it getting warped into this bacon, that's real obvious in person. I don't see how it's like floppy now. And I just did this a little bit. So stay stitching is a nice technique. Now I can show you that. It's pretty simple. You see that a lot in garment sewing. So I know if you're a garment sewer, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They do that a lot of times on, so my grain of the fabric is going this way. If I cut across the grain, it's even less stable. And if I cut a curve, it's also less stable. So whatever your seam allowance you're using, whether it's a 1/4 inch or in my case 3/8, just going to put my needle in there and I'm just going to stitch around. And I'm just adding a row of stitching close to the edge to give that edge a little bit more stability, because my thread is not going to stretch and go all bacony on me. And it will also help to lock in fraying. If you're worried about that line of stitching showing, you can go just a little bit closer to the edge than where you'll really be sewing in real life. So if I'm really sewing at 3/8, maybe I'll take this a little closer at a 1/4 inch and just stabilize the edge. And then if I kind of pull, I'm pulling against that really stable thread, and I'm not going to bacon up the side of my raw edge fabric. If you're going to sew it right away into a quilt top and finish it all in one session, you don't have to worry about that. But it is a nice little technique. Like say you're going on vacation for a month and this is going to get thrown in a drawer and rattled around and you're not sure when you're going to pick it up again. This ensures that your quilt that you put in the drawer is the same quilt that comes out of the drawer. That was bonus. That wasn't even in the slides. Okay, how are we doing? Did anyone have questions? Did that make it more confusing for someone? Does it make sense?
I have a question. I
Yeah.
noticed the little green thing you have on your desk. Is
Yeah.
is that something you place under this thing here, or?
Are you talking about you talking about this?
Not that. Like when you go to cut, I see a little
Oh,
green, like turquoisey color thing.
my
Yeah.
cutting mat?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So when you go, this is just a sample, so I can do whatever with this. So there's two ways to cut your fabric. If you have scissors, you'll take your straight edge. Do I have a pen? If you're going to cut your fabric anyways on that line, you can mark with anything because you're cutting that fabric, so you won't see the line. So be careful what kind of marking tool you use. If you're cutting there, you can mark with a Sharpie. If you're not cutting there, the Sharpie is going to show. So pretending this is where I want to cut mine, I'm going to take whatever I'm using as a straight edge, turn my pen in toward the straight edge, and make my mark. And then I can come with my scissors and carefully cut on the mark that I made. If you don't want to worry about remembering which tool to use for which purpose, I generally have an erasable fabric marker that you spritz water on and the markings go away. And I tend to use that for everything because then I don't have to remember which one is in my hand, and I never accidentally do a no-no with my Sharpie. So if I'm using the rotary cutter method, then you don't have to mark it. You're just going to place your ruler where you want to cut. And this is a spinning razor blade is really all that is. It's a spinning razor blade with a handle, kind of like an extra sharp pizza cutter. And I place my blade against my straight edge, my acrylic cutting ruler that I've got, and I push down. So with a scissor, you've got a blade and you've got another blade against it to cut. With this, I've got one blade and I press against that mat to cut. And it's going to protect my blade edge and it's going to protect my table underneath and give me something to push against. Because if you do this on your wood table, you're going to have 1,000 gouges and your blade's going to go dull really fast because you're cutting your table. This will cut through anything you push it on. So this is a backing mat. This one, let's take a look. Not that I'm advertising. I use a hard cutting mat, and some people swear by these self-healing ones. I've never used one, and I've never felt the need for one. I'm not saying anything bad against them. I'm sure they're delightful. They're really expensive. They're like $80. So I have this thin, hard plastic one, and it's never given me any grief. And I've had the same one for like 20 years, and it's still in great shape. So this is called a quilting mate. And what I like about it, it's like 23 inches square. It's a June Taylor product. I don't know if you can see that label. When I'm aiming the camera at things like that, I can't see what I'm looking at. So I'm taking it on faith that I'm aiming at what I think I'm aiming at. And it's got all of your lines marked out for 23 inches in both directions. So it gives me a nice big cutting area. And you just store it flat, and it doesn't accumulate as much lint as the self-healing. The self-healing ones have a soft layer on top, so when your blade goes, it sort of goes down in that soft layer, and then it's somehow the material kind of comes back together. But also when you push your blade down, you push little bits of lint in there, and then you got to get that lint out. This one's like hard. It's kind of like PVC. I don't know. It's a little more flexible than PVC, but it's not soft and rubbery. It's kind of got a crispy texture. And it has a nice little bit of grip to it. So when you cut, everything sort of stays put for you. And this one has some markings on it to help you have some reference lines. I use my inch lines, but all these like hearts and squares and circles, I don't use those reference lines as much. I find that I square up my fabric with the mat, and then if I'm going to cut a weird angle, I'm going to use these reference, well, you can see that. These angled reference lines on my ruler is how I do that. That's how I do it. So yeah, that was a really long answer. Yes, this is a cutting mat that you put under to use your rotary cutter, which is like an ultra sharp razor pizza cutter. Christine, do you have video? Can you show her yours? This one is a 45. And it's kind of the middle standard size. And mine has the guard drops down, and then you can see that's shiny, that's the blade. And then when I push it up, the guard comes up. And it's got a straight handle. Christine has a ergonomic one, and her guard, you like squeeze a trigger, and as soon as you let it go, the guard pops up, and you don't have to worry about forgetting to close your guard. And then if you're gonna do fiddly little small pieces or curved shapes, they also have cutting templates where it's made of the same plastic, but there's like a groove that you're trying to follow. And for those, they have these little bitty guys. I forget what size this is. So it's a 45 is kind of the standard. 60 is big. If you're processing a lot of fabric, a big 60 millimeter blade is nice. And I want to say this is this like a 15? Or like a 20? I forget what the small size is. But they come typically in 3 sizes. And I happen to use Fiskars. And you can get these at whatever, Walmart, the sewing store, the Amazon. They have them everywhere. The big 2 brands that you hear about a lot are Fiskars and Olfa. They sent me this one when I bought something, probably when I bought my long arm. They sent me a rotary cutter that's an Olfa. And it's a little bit fancier. The way that you change the blade is a little bit different. It's purple, which is kind of cute, little Halloween colors. Fiskars is like orange and white, super plain, but it does the job. So those are 2 really common brands. I'm sure there's other brands, but these are the ones you hear about a lot. That was a lot of chitter chatter, but hopefully it answered the question.
Mm-hmm.
Okie doke. So this was another quick one. I know I allot 2 hours for this, but I know you're grateful that I don't take that long. Were there any other questions? Anybody want to show their block off? Anybody hung up on something?
Together.
We're doing strips. So, I mean,
It's going together pretty good.
I'm trying.
Nice. Nice.
Mom
Looks
is
good.
long than I am, but I just finished my my 3rd row. So
Very good.
I'm on the 4th row. So what's
yeah,
the
I know.
difference?
You're like you make me
Oh,
nervous because you're
She's a speed demon.
Yeah, just don't pay any attention to her.
It's
When
not
you
a race.
Okay, I've pressed them opposite ways to put the rows together. Now, then what do I do with those seams? Do you suggest I press them open? Because now I'll have these 3 seams across here. Do I press those open or do I press them all one way?
So quilter's choice. You can press them open. Let me see if I can. Because where it all meets, there is a little bit of bulk there.
Yeah.
And you can press those open, which will reduce that bulk a little bit. And when you're quilting, you won't feel that like hump that you go over as much. It takes a little bit longer, and a seam that's pressed to one side is a little bit stronger. So this is for like a toddler who's going to sling it around and yank on it, and you're going to watch it 8,000 times. To the side is a little bit stronger if you're concerned about durability. If you are more concerned about prettiness, if this is for an adult who's going to put it on their bed and only wash it not as often, and they're going to be more gentle with it, pressing it open does give you a little bit flatter where all 4 seams come together.
That's good to know because these are actually going to toddlers, so they need to be pressed to the side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Precious
It's,
toddlers.
every quilter has their preference, and there really isn't a wrong way. And if you get into piecing, you can actually spin the seam. Am I going to confuse people? Let's do it. So this is a time when you can do everything perfect and still use your seam ripper. Let's see if I can find a good example. So after the seam, I might send you the video. Quilt in a Day does such a good job of showing this. So where you have a lot of seams coming together, outside of the seam, you can seam rip those couple of stitches and you can get the seams to spin. And it's supposed to...
Oh!
All right, so this seam allowance is going down and this seam allowance is going up. So I've already got like this circle going. And, oh, I seam ripped the wrong one. Ha. Helps to pay attention to what you're doing. So you seam rip this little flap that's after, it's in the seam allowance. So you don't want a hole in your quilt. So it's the little flap. And you follow the direction that your seam, so you had one going up and one going down, and you seam rip the other one and you spin them around, and it's actually the flattest way. And if you had a 4-patch, so I have like monkey paw,
Right.
on the back, if I spin it correctly, I will have a mini baby 4-patch, right sides, that are exactly what I had on the back. So I've got, this is the little paw fabric, the little monkey fabric, and it's right side is facing the camera right now.
So you're clipping it part way and then pulling, okay.
Right, I just ripped out on one little seam. I had to rip a few of my stitches on the seam allowance side, not on my quilt side. Right. And then follow the two that have a strong direction and you spin them around. And that's actually, that's kind of advanced, but it makes a really flat, and if you have a lot of layers coming together, that corner is nice and flat. I really only have, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of fabric, which isn't too bad, all the way around. If you press them all to the same side, you'll have that one side that has like 6 or 8 layers of fabric, and it's quite a hump.
Okay.
So people spin the seams. Eleanor Burns' Quilt in a Day does a much better job of demonstrating than I did, but that's...
We will look.
I don't know if you can even... Okay. So if you have a 4-patch over here, which is 4 squares coming together in a corner, and you spin the seams, you should have a right side 4-patch on the back, is how it looks. Gotcha. Which I think is neat. Little mini baby, 3/8 inch. So that's advanced. Nobody has to do that. But when you feel from the top quilt side, it is nice and flat. And if you were doing that free motion quilting or on a long arm, you won't feel like a big ramp that can sometimes mess you up and give you a wobble when you try to run over it.
Okay. We need to look. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
We didn't talk a whole lot about that because there's no really matched seams and there's not a lot of seam bulk in a log cabin. But some patterns you do have, like stars, you might have 8 little triangles coming together, and then that's a lot of seam allowances, and where's all that going to go? So there are patterns where it matters more.
Yeah. Okay.
I try to pick an easy one because bite off the first little bit and get that down, then we can start to go on and finesse other things.
Next, is she going to do an intermediate one?
I probably will. So seam allowances, people are very passionate about seam allowances. So if this were my quilt, most quilts, you want to see some contrast in your piecing. If you spend all the time cutting it up into little pieces and sewing it back together, you want to see all that work. So usually you'll have, generally speaking, it'll be like a light fabric next to a dark fabric next to a light fabric next to a dark fabric. And people who press to the side always say press to the dark side. And you do that because if this fabric is very dark and I push the seam allowance this way, I might be able to see it through this light fabric. So, and then generally speaking, if I always press to the dark side, when I go to combine those pieces later, generally my dark is going to be against a light and my light is going to be against the dark. So automatically my seam allowances will be opposite and lock. And that works out on a lot of quilt patterns. So if you're quilting like I do by eyeball, or if you're quilting like an old traditional pattern where you don't have detailed and fussy instructions, if you always press your seams to the dark side, you have a pretty good chance of having the seams set up to lock and lay nicely in your finished block. The fancier quilt blocks with a lot going on, they'll actually put pressing instructions in the pattern. For the reason someone's trying to call me. The reason they do that is so when you sew that block together, all your seams lock nicely and help give you precision in your points. It helps hold those corners exactly in place while you sew them. But there's people who swear up and down by pressing them open. It takes a little more time. You've got to get in there and scrape it with your fingernail, then come in with your iron. And usually when you press open, you're doing that from the wrong side. When you press your seam allowances to the side, typically you'll put the light colored fabric down. You're doing right side up. You put your iron on there and you roll this way. So my seam allowance is going to naturally tuck toward the dark fabric, and I roll the seam open with my iron. This is my iron. And that's how, like Jenny Doan presses to the dark side. I know that Tracy from the sewing channel, she is very adamant about pressing seams open. And as you get to know these sewing personalities on, these girls are on YouTube, but on whatever media platform, they all have a preference and they all have a reason for that. And neither one is bad. There's just pros and cons. I'm showing you my way of doing things. There's 150 bazillion ways of doing it, and they all have pros and cons. And as you leave the nest of quilting and start doing your own thing, you will experiment with different techniques. You'll try what this lady did. You'll try what that guy did. You'll try your own thing, and you'll definitely come up with your own secret recipe of what works for you, and you'll have your own sort of signature quilting style. Some people, they want to get their quilts done fast. It's the difference between what they'll do and what they won't do. They don't enjoy all the fussiness. And if they had to be fussy, they just wouldn't do it. So for them, that's not the best method. Some people just relish the precision and having everything be just perfect and laboring over every point, and that's what brings them joy in quilting. And so everybody's going to do it a little differently, because the part of it that brings them joy is a little different, and you'll find that blend that brings you the most joy. And that's really all you care about. Very few people are quilting for survival anymore these days. We're quilting for joy. So whatever brings you joy, do it that way. That's my speech. All quilts are valid. Some are closer or further to what you originally pictured in your mind, but they're still good. Alrighty. Well, if there's no more questions, homework, if you're sewing along with class, is just to get your top done and the seams pressed. If you are lagging behind, there is no problem. There's no pressure. You're going to sew along at your own pace. Sew at the pace that brings you joy. So you can catch up on your own time. This video is going to post to YouTube like all the other ones have so far. Oh, no need to trim at this stage. So your edges might be not exactly perfectly straight. After you quilt your quilt, the quilting process creates divots. What you see when you quilt a quilt, you don't really see the thread. What you're seeing is the shadow of the little ditch that the thread made as you stitch through there. So by this happening, it's pulling in your fabric of your top quilt a little bit. So your quilt is going to crinkle up a little bit in the quilting process. So to trim the very outside of your top quilt, we're going to wait until all the quilting is done for that. because you want that crinkle to happen first, and then you trim your nice tidy line after, because you're never quite sure exactly how much crinkle you're going to get and where you're going to get crinkle. So the safest way is to do the quilting first, and don't worry about the outside edges of your top quilt being perfect until after, because they're going to get crooked again. So you might as well wait and trim them once instead of trimming twice. So don't worry about trimming. If you are still making blocks, you'll make 4 corner blocks, which is your accent center, and whatever color group is your background all the way around. And you'll have 3 full laps around your center. You'll have 12 of your half and half. So 2 strips from your star color group, 2 strips from your background color group, and keep spiraling around. And if you get that done and you're ready to move on, you'll sew those into strips and sew those strips into your top sheet, and you'll be done. All right. Happy sewing. Have fun. We'll see you next week. Next week, we will be looking at how we're going to quilt this. Have a great time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.